blame America first, where pretty much whatever happens in the world, you somehow connect it back to, in this case, Israel, or Israel conducting the war in Gaza. And one of the biggest proponents of this idea is the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who always finds a way to blame Israel for everything. So blame Israel first. So we're gonna talk about some of his recent comments he made about Israel conducting war and what is Israel's responsibility when conducting this war. Joining me today is Morgan. Hey Morgan, how are you doing?
Not too bad, Daniel. How are you?
Pretty good. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about some of his quotes and also more generally about the idea of how Israel should conduct the war. We might focus mainly on the idea of humanitarian aid, but I think there's a good amount of content to go through this. So I'm just gonna read the first of his quote and we can talk about it. So he said he attacked Israel, saying that it's Israel's responsibility as the occupying power in the Gaza Strip to restore public order and security so that humanitarian assistance can be provided to civilians. And this comes after, there have been reports of like several humanitarian aid trucks being raided, being basically taken over by either Palestinians or Hamas specifically. And Guterres blames Israel for this. So, Morgan, what are your first thoughts about this?
Well, I think people should notice right from the off how he's deciding to frame that. He's framing it as Israel is the occupying power in the Gaza Strip. Now, that's maybe a slightly different claim from the typical kind of claim about occupation in Gaza that's made, which is that Israel has been occupying the Gaza Strip since 1968. And therefore, that's why Hamas somehow has some legitimacy in fighting the Israelis and in perpetrating October 7th. Now, of course, that's nonsense and hasn't been the case since 2005 at the very least. That's when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. What he seems to be meaning here is that because the IDF has gone into Gaza, it is now the occupying power, it's now the authority. I would challenge whether that's really a good description of what's going on, because Gaza is a war zone. And so what Gaza really is a kind of anarchy where there is a large force contingent which is trying to monopolize force, which is the IDF, but it has resistance from that, which is from Hamas, either from down in the tunnels or from their fighters who are melded in within the civilian population. So I don't think it's really right to describe Israel, the IDF, really as the occupying power. So I don't, and by doing that, what he's trying to do is to confer, as you say, responsibility on them for any of these things which break out. And yet, I don't think that's right at all. And so I think that's what people should note just from the beginning of his statement.
And just to continue his quote a little bit, Guterres described Gaza as completely lawless, said most aid trucks entering Gaza are looted, and claimed Israel was preventing Palestinian civil police from securing the shipments. There is a total chaos in most of the strip, he said. And so now there is a question. Is it because he claimed it's Israel's responsibility to secure this? So is it on Israel to restore public order and security? And the answer, I think, is not yet. The war hasn't been finished yet. What you do when, and yeah, similar to what has been, we always use the example of World War II. I think I'll have to find a different war to go to but that's a clear example for people to follow. So it's the similar thing that happened in Germany and Japan. People, the civilian or just general people in Germany and Japan were starving, were on brink of starvation, but would basically, the society, as you described it, was soon to be in complete anarchy. Was it on America to basically go in and restore order? No, the America's responsibility, or in this case, Israel's responsibility, is to their own citizens, is to go in and make sure the threat disappears. And after that, we talked a few times about what could be the aftermath. But if the aftermath is that Israel will occupy Gaza or will try to occupy it, try to reform it, after that, I think they would have responsibility to, in a sense, restore some some sense of public order and some sense of security. But you cannot do that while not only Hamas, but the civilians themselves are still actively fighting against you. That's, I mean, we've talked about altruism. That's a completely altruistic goal, that you have these people who joined Hamas on October 7th, held hostages in their homes, and now you have to come in and provide them some security while they are still actively fighting against you. It's a completely inverted idea. So no, it is not on Israel to restore public order and security, or at least not yet. As I mentioned, Guterres and people like him keep forgetting that Hamas, along with the Palestinian people, have declared the war on Israel. The only responsibility Israel has currently is to protect their own citizens by making sure this doesn't happen. So by destroying Hamas, and despite what one IDF spokesperson said, that you cannot destroy Hamas because it's an idea. No, you can destroy Hamas, mainly because it is an idea.
Yes, and I think Israel would have a responsibility to, after the war is finished, to come in and restore order. But that's not because suddenly they have a responsibility to the Palestinians. They have a responsibility as part of their position as the Israeli government to protect their own people, to come in and restore order, to make sure that that threat isn't just extinguished in the short term, but it's extinguished in the long term. And the Japan example is a good one. I know it gets brought up a lot, but it's a good one for people to keep in mind. And I'd encourage everyone to go and listen to the podcast we did with Joseph Tebenkin about Japan and its occupation after World War II by the United States, and just how effectively they were able to neutralize the threat coming from that society, and particularly in regards to the attitude of the civilian population. Whereas we know, unfortunately, based on the kind of polling that's done, and even just based on anecdotal kind of evidence that's coming out of Gaza about the large amount of support that the civilian populace still seems to have for Hamas. It seems to be chipping away. You know, there are people here and there who are recognizing that Hamas is destructive for them. It doesn't mean they're necessarily turned around ideologically. They might just rather some other radical Islamic group are coming in. But there is some recognition that Hamas isn't a good thing for them. But still, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority seem to be in favor of Hamas. In Japan, although it started out that the civilian populace was on the side of the imperial government, by the end of the war, if you listen to the information that Joseph puts across, they are not anymore. The US really has broken their will. Part of doing that was with the nuclear weapons, as terrible and as powerful as those were. And part of doing that as well was through withholding humanitarian aid, quote unquote, until after there was total surrender. And so I think that's just such a great case study. And if anyone hasn't listened to our episode with Joseph, which is almost certainly true because far too few people watch that one, people should go check that out.
And yeah, I mean, you mentioned the idea of humanitarian aid and starvation. So just to bring it back to the Japan, there was actually a so-called operation called Operation Starvation, which was pretty much the only purpose of it was bombing Japanese convoys to basically try to starve Japan out. And many people afterwards claimed that because this operation happened in, like, I think late 44 or maybe even early 45, so really almost to the end of the war, and many people have claimed if this has been started sooner, because by the time US has gotten to the shores on Japan, Japanese people were actually starving, were on the brink of actual starvation, not what people claim is going on in Gaza. So because of this starvation tactic, because of this in a sense choking tactic, many more people were saved. And if this was started much sooner, many more people could have been saved. And it's similar here. After October 7th, Israel did many good things. It stopped water from flowing in. It stopped or more like paused many of the aid trucks from going in, but they after not that much of a long time, they did resume them. But for a while, it did seem like this could be a really quick war, properly done, which would actually lead to something else. But again, when the Palestinian people don't feel this war. I mean, you said it, they still support Hamas to a large extent. And when they don't support Hamas or the Hamas leaders, they support people who are more extreme. They're supporting people who, or leaders of the Palestinian people who are sitting in jail for killing Jews. And that's why they're popular. That's why they are viewed as better for them. Someone who just, sits and doesn't do anything, in a sense, someone like the uh the head of Mahmoud Abbas, uh, or rather Mahmoud Abbas, who doesn't really do much or doesn't seem like he's doing much, that does seem too compromising with Israel, is seen as not someone who is fit to lead the Palestinian people. And as long as this happens, that's why I'm still afraid uh, of the possible occupation after this war, because again, Hamas still has support, which even if you destroy Hamas, if the ideology of the Palestinian people hasn't changed, then you will have maybe another intifada. You will have basically such a great amount of resistance that unless you can really put it down, unless you can be really strong about not allowing any of it happen, yeah, this will continue, and that's what I'm afraid of. Anything you want to say about this?
Well, I mean, just turning to Gutierrez and the UN, because we're really focusing on his comments. Both of us this past week were at the Objectivist conference in California, and I think we both attended a talk that was given, or a discussion, by Yaron Brook and Onkar Ghate. And there's a quote from Onkar in there which really stuck in my mind, which was that he said of the UN that any international organization which contains dictatorships is an abomination. And that was a really sort of memorable line or quote, but from a whole discussion about the UN, I think, towards the end of the talk. And when we see someone like Antonio Gutierrez, who's one of the the major representatives of this organization, he's the general secretary or something like that, right?
Secretary General, I think.
Secretary General, there you go. Why is he so hard on Israel? And the UN is peculiarly hard on Israel. I can't remember the exact number of official condemnations or sanctions or whatever it is that they've issued now against Israel, but it's shockingly high. And it's why have they done that? Not only because the good countries in the UN have been warped into an anti-Israel perspective, but because the UN contains some of the worst dictatorships in the world and in that region. And so the UN has evil people right into its core. And so it shouldn't be a surprise, really, that Gutierrez can come out of a situation where, some aid trucks have been raided by Palestinians or whatever, or some kind of anarchistic violence has gone on. And the only thing he can say is, well, this is Israel's fault, because everything is Israel's fault, as you were saying. No matter what is going on, there's a way in which it can be warped to come back on Israel. And that's because the UN is an abomination, as Onkar was saying, and is warped by an anti-Israel perspective right down into its core. And, more broadly, people in the West need to have a real rethink about whether these kind of supranational, international organizations are worth anything and whether you should have them. And yet there's an awful way in which, because they've existed for a long time, and because they're meant to represent humanitarian, cosmopolitan values, I guess, they're just taken as if they're metaphysical. The universe came into existence and the UN headquarters were there in Manhattan. So, and that's awful. People need to shake off that kind of mental lethargy and rethink these things.
And this idea of the UN really comes from, the idea of, some people say egalitarianism, but this idea of basically moral equality, that basically whatever, in a sense, if you ignore the 5 nations who are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, all nations are equal. All nations are seen as equal. And again, this could be, on one hand, the most free nation. I don't know what it could be, America, or some of the by the Heritage Foundation that are like top 1. I don't know, Ireland or something. Although even Ireland now is a bit more weird. But let's see, you have these like free nation, or at least when it was founded, probably United States was the freest country in the world. So you have countries like this, and on the other hand, you have like complete dictatorships. You have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia, you have all, for every Israel, you have like 30 Arab countries, which probably have never even heard about the idea of individual rights, have no view of what it means to have a proper government. All of them are focused on achieving some sort of theocracy. And even when it's not, even when they try to be secular, it's usually just some kind of like secular dictatorship. So even on that way, they are not going much further. And these are equal. All these are viewed as equal in the eyes of the United Nations. And when you have, the UN Secretary General, someone who is in a sense the heart and mind, or is supposed to be like, this is like the main guy of the UN, he needs to have the similar view of the world. He views every single nation, or even non-nation. I mean, Hamas is not even in the UN, but let's say the Palestinian Authority is, which it is, although not fully. I think they're just like an observing member. Uh, Although there have been calls, and I think even calls by Guterres to actually fully admit Palestinian Authority or Palestinian territories into the UN. So yeah, that he views all of them as the same. So why would he have any, why would he view Israel any differently? Why would he view even any conflict as differently? And that's kind of the next point I want to go to, but I don't know if you want to put in something before of how these people view war.
No, go on. Let's move on.
So, yeah, something that has been happening for a while now is this complete change of how people view war. And I think it starts with the United Nations and with the basically idea that we always have to negotiate. We always have to prevent war. I mean, we talked about it, I think 2 days ago. The idea we need peace. We need peace, and anything that stops war and uh, starts peace is good. Uh, and I think so. There is that one part that they try to stop war at any chance they can. But I think there's something much more sinister is, and I'm trying to find a good term for it, but I feel like they're trying to civilize war in a sense that they think that war, and I think it stems from the idea that all nations are equal. Because if all nations are equal, then the war between them has to, in a sense, have rules, and both parties should be able to agree to those rules since it's equal. They view it as a sport, I think is the uh, term I used in the past. Either a sport or they try to civilize it. And what that leads them is to say, yeah, you need to have breaks. You need to have a temporary ceasefire, so uh, so people on both sides can recover, and then we can continue the war. As if it's not this uh, completely, in a sense, uncivilized way of basically conducting relationships. That's what it is, and it has to be recognized as this. Hamas did an atrocity, did a horrible act, started the war on October 7 against the Israeli people. Now Israel has to respond in kind, has to respond in a way that makes sense. It cannot just go back and try the way it has been conducted. Do it slowly, make sure no one dies. I mean, it's war. You have to realize, you have to call it for what it is, and you have to uh, conduct it in kind. Um, so I think yeah, I mean, one example or one idea I wanted to bring up is that, yeah, you cannot. I mean, it hurts me to even say this because I don't think reason is on side of any of this. But in a sense, they try to bring reason into war. They try to bring reason, or the idea of maybe some sort of thinking, some sort of even pragmatism to the act of war, which is inherently just unreasonable. It's completely out of the ordinary. It's completely something that's not normal, and they try to view it as something normal. It sort of reminds me of the idea of Ethics of Emergencies by Ayn Rand, when people ask her, well, what do you do when you're like on a boat and there's like 3 people dying here, 3 people dying here? You can only save one of them. And this is often viewed as like, this is the morality. And something that she always brings up is, this is like not a normal state of living. If we lived in such a state at all times, no ethics would be possible, no civilization would be possible. We wouldn't be able to live. So the only, in a sense, goal in such situations is to try to get out of those situations into the normal state of living as soon as you can, as possibly as you can, and as reasonably as you can in those situations. And I think while it is a bit of a different thing in kind, it is a similar in war. The only goal of it is to bring us back to the state where we can actually live normal, where we can reason. And the only way to do it long term is to fully stop whatever was the reason that started the war. So in this sense, is to fully, in one kind, fully stop Hamas from being able to conduct it again. But second and most importantly, fully destroy the ideology that allowed this to happen.
I think in regards to the future of war, what we're seeing going on at the moment in regards to Israel, in regards to how the Western world is reacting and commenting on and condemning Israel for doing X, Y, Z, is that we're storing up a real crisis for ourselves in the future when we next need to go to war. And so when I say we here, I have in mind the UK, the United States, Western Europe, more broadly, Canada, these kind of nations. Because we haven't, in a large scale, gone to like full war for quite a while. The last time I think really a country like the UK, or the last time the UK went into an equivalent kind of war like this was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we saw there was some of this early attitude setting in, a real resistance to doing it. However, also there was some meaningful, proper resistance to that, because there were real questions about some of those wars, about why were we going into them in the first place. But we saw the first kind of inklings of the current attitude. But what we're seeing now is an opposition to war on principle, like opposition to war per se. And in the past, the only people who advocated that attitude were pacifists, who were a small part of the population, often influenced by religion and religious motivations, often kind of, I'm thinking of Quakers, groups like this. If you move to the 60s or something, maybe more hippie-ish kind of people. But now, people who in other contexts wouldn't consider themselves pacifists, and I don't think would hold it in their minds that they're pacifists in any way, are acting as if they're pacifists. And
just to quickly jump in, you see this on the right in America, like a mainstream right, like the people who support Donald Trump are suddenly like completely anti-war. The party that 10, 15, 20 years ago was for building democracies, in a sense, the idea of neoconservatism.
Yeah, and part of the reason why I say this is a real crisis is because this isn't just like one political wing is bad on this, and maybe you can have the other wing who'd come in and sort things out. The left and the right really are opposed to war on principle now. Now, for slightly different motivations. The right seems to be more a kind of cynicism and lethargy or apathy, kind of exhaustion about, well, we've tried so many of these wars, let's not get involved in them. What real interest do we have anyway in any of these kind of things? And I think they'll blank out even when we really do have an interest in this kind of stuff. But so we aren't going to be able to do this kind of stuff in the future when we need to. And we're seeing some of this attitude being expressed about Israel. But then when we should need to go to war in the future, we just are not going to be able to do it. And I mean, there are so many ways in which I think you can see that. Even the attitude towards soldiers. Historically, soldiers were such a valorized, kind of well-admired group of people. And we're both in the US at the moment. And I think broadly that attitude still remains here, although I imagine it's somewhat in decline. But in the UK now, although there's still some patriotic feeling towards soldiers, it just isn't there in the same way that it used to be. And I think part of that is that in the past, what soldiers did in going out and defending and securing the future and security of a nation was viewed as a wholly admirable thing, and the fact they were putting their lives on the line for it. And now it's viewed as kind of suspicious. Aren't you really just an implement of death, of oppression in some way, imperialism, something like that? And that's been a long project that people have campaigned throughout the 20th century to insubstantiate within our kind of collective consciousness, let's say, although that's not really a thing, within people's minds. And so we've got a real problem coming up for ourselves. And I don't think we can do much to change it in the short term within the scope of the war in Israel. I don't think we can turn that public opinion around, but we've got some time before the next war comes around, and there needs to be a real campaign from people who have the guts to go and do this and the real interest in doing it to change people's minds on this, because it'll be very important.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up the idea of how soldiers are viewed, and I think it's a really good barometer of to see how a society is going. Basically, how the actual necessary functions of the government are treated. So in this case, it would be soldiers, policemen, and the courts, or lawyers and judges and whatever else comes with that. And something that so this idea that soldiers are that when I was young, that's what I watched in the movies. Whenever like a soldier saw, people stood up and like, thank you for the service, they would like shake hands. And this is something that I've never seen in my country, and I don't think anyone has pretty much ever done. And I think the main reason is because my country was founded in the 90s after it collapsed, after the Soviet bloc collapsed, and we didn't have any war that was something like the Second World War, or maybe even something, let's say, like the Korean War or Vietnam War. Even with those, it starts to get a bit bad, and maybe that's where the corruption started. But people still had the idea of the Second World War veterans in mind, and we never had that. And I think that's when it becomes problematic, when the people who deserve it, soldiers, policemen, and you see the similar thing with policemen, where uh they were and they are still in some places respected, but they are also increasingly becoming not respected, are seen uh as the worst people, the worst people with the worst jobs. And this corruption will lead to something much worse if it's not fixed. And maybe it's a topic for one day, because it's the idea that I have been thinking about a while, when what happens when people who have basically when the systems in place that are needed are starting to be completely uh viewed completely cynically. And you could see it something like the police, but even something like courts, or the idea of electoral process. When you I mean, I'm bringing out the right again, but when you talk to the Trump supporters, they have complete they have no faith, they have no actual belief in the American system. And that's when it starts being problematic. So maybe it's a topic for another day. But let me thank Bonnie for a super chat, and I'll try to quickly scan if there are any nice comments. But anything you'd like to say before we say goodbyes?
Just that, one of the things I think we've been encouraging people to do generally, and in the context of thought, is to think critically about almost everything that's coming your way, to just dissect whether it makes sense. And the whole idea of humanitarian aid is one of these things you just need to unpick, because the idea of calling it humanitarian is to put a label on it where it's automatically put into the category of the good and the right in the world. And yet, even if this is coming from a humanitarian kind of intention, where it wants to be nice and generous towards other people, the ends which this is bringing into effect, that this is creating in the world, is the elongation of the war. And again, the Japan episode with Joseph is a good one to have a look at for some more context on that, because it was only by denying the humanitarian aid until there was surrender that the war was able to be brought to an end quite so effectively and permanently as that. And it's the same situation here. By bringing in aid, it means things go on longer. And just calling it humanitarian doesn't mean that fact of reality is, you can get around that somehow. And so people, just be aware that just because people name something, if they call it humanitarian, that doesn't automatically make it a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. We always say that humanitarian aid in this case is aid for the enemy. It's either aid for directly for Hamas or the Palestinian people, who again are on one hand responsible Hamas indirectly by not opposing them and by in many cases supporting them, and are also directly supporting this conflict by, well, first by joining on October 7th and by holding the hostages. And so I have someone in the chat saying that we're evading by saying that the current police is not fascistic in America, and the courts are not corrupt, or I'm not sure if he said the corrupt, but the soldiers are also fascistic. If you prefer anarchy to the system we have in America right now, then you can say what you can, but I think as long as you have means of changing the system, so in this case, you still have the democratic process, you still have the way of, you still have free speech. Yeah, I think you still have good enough courts or really strong courts. You have the Supreme Court. I think there are still good, the institutions in the America are still holding up well enough that there is a chance to restore this. But again, if you, oh, I think my microphone was muted completely. If you, no, I think it was like much quieter. But if you are completely opposing the system, what you are giving out on a plate is anarchy, and you're basically saying you'd rather take a chance with whatever will come out of that anarchy than what we have right now. And with the ideas in the society right now, I'm trusting the founding fathers 300 days ago, 300 years ago, that this system will keep us going for a little bit longer than whatever intellectuals we have right now, that whatever comes out of this anarchy will be any better.
Yes, I mean, if the person's saying that the police and the courts, whatever, in all the Western world are fascistic at the moment, I'm sorry, but you're being ridiculous. If you look at real fascistic countries, the police and the courts were, were fake. They were mock trials to just confirm the decision that had already been made. And the police were an instrument of terror. Now, the police in the Western world there are problems with them in the UK and the US and wherever else. And those are meaningful problems that people need to think through. But the police and the courts, the system of laws, are broadly still things which help people. And I think the thing that's going on in the West more broadly now is that as we're still experiencing a decline because we're confused about our fundamental ideas and there's all these kind of things, the broad effect is that the police are declining, and they're declining in the sense that there is some more kind of negative things that they're doing. They're acting outside the proper bounds of their powers. Let's put it that. However, they aren't fascistic, because when a police force is fascistic, it's where they're no longer protecting their people and they're the active implement of oppressing them at all points and using force on them at all points. Now, we see some instances of the police using force against their own people, but that isn't the norm, not even close. And you can't be hyperbolic about putting those labels onto the police, because it's just an inaccurate description at the end of the day. And the same with soldiers in the West. So it's just not true.
And yeah, and that's what I always say, when you start giving these ideas that you cannot trust any of the legitimate functions of the government, revolution is the only way forward. So you shouldn't be talking now, you should be conducting a revolution if you actually believe in that. So I'll just comment two more things. So he says, well, don't strawman me, we could have a constitutional convention. Again, if you believe the ideas in today's world will give us a better constitution than the founding fathers did 250 years ago, good luck. And for that, I would only recommend the Daily Objective 514, more than 600 episodes ago, when we had Brian Simpson, a constitutional lawyer, on an episode, I think it was with James Valiant, talking exactly about this. Should we have a constitutional convention? I don't think his answer will surprise you. But with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Morgan. We'll see you tomorrow again on the Daily Objective and also on the reality show. There's no reality show extra today. but we should be back next week. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and bye-bye.